בפאנל הזה. אני בשנים האחרונות, אני מחנך יהודי שעובד כבר 20 שנה בכל מיני מסגרות, בעיקר עם יהדות התפוצות, ובשנים האחרונות בקריירה שלי אני מתמקד בעיקר באיך אפשר להנגיש את הנרטיב של יהדות צפון אמריקה לציבור הישראלי. כי אם אנחנו מדברים פה על היותנו עם אחד, ויש לנו חרדה על הגורל המשותף שלנו, אז האחריות מוטלת גם עלינו הישראלים, שהרבה פעמים קצת שחצנים וקצת שוללים את אחינו היהודים מחוץ לארץ ישראל. התפקיד שלנו גם ללמוד על מה שקורה שם, והסדרה שיצרתי, שיצאה לאוויר באפריל האחרון, היא דוגמה מובהקת לאיך אפשר לספר את הסיפור של בצפון אמריקה בצורה נגישה ומהנה אפילו, ובאמת מדהים לראות איך הסדרה, אני חושב, יצרה איזשהו שיח שלא היה קיים לפני כן בחברה הישראלית, ואני מאוד מקווה שהשיח הזה ימשיך. אני יכול להגיד לכם בוודאות לגבי הביוגרפיה האישית שלי, שאלמלא היחסים שלי עם התנועה הקונסרבטיבית בארצות הברית והתנועה המסורתית כאן בישראל, אני משער שלא הייתי נמצא במקום הזה. אני 16 שנים הייתי במחנות רמה בצפון אמריקה, הייתי שליח בקהילות קונסרבטיביות, הייתי רכז סניפים ארצי בנועם במשך 3 שנים, ואני יכול להגיד לכם שלפחות מההבנה שלי, לתנועה המסורתית יש תפקיד ואחריות מאוד מאוד חזקה, וברורה גם עבורי, להיות גשר חי בין שתי הקהילות הללו. בגלל השורשים ההיסטוריים של התנועה בצפון אמריקה, בגלל מערכות היחסים הכל כך קרובות ואינטימיות שיש בין יהודים מסורתיים כאן ויהודים קונסרבטיביים בארצות הברית, ובגלל השותפות הרעיונית והאידיאולוגית בין שתי התנועות הללו, יש פה יכולת באמת של התנועה להיות גשר חי בין ישראלים לבין יהודים ליברליים בארצות הברית. והפאנל שלנו באמת הולך לעסוק בעניין הזה, אז תודה שהזמנתם אותי. ואני אפרוץ ישר לסוגיה שהיא באמת מטלטלת, אני חושב, את התנועה, או צריכה לטלטל את התנועה. אני משער שאולי חלקכם יודעים, אבל לפני כמה שבועות יצא סקר מאוד משמעותי, או מחקר מאוד משמעותי, מחקר פיו של שנת 2020, ובמחקר הזה הם מפלחים את השיוך לזרמים ולתנועות, והתגלה שם נתון מאוד מעניין. 17% מהיהודים בארצות הברית היום מזדהים כקונסרבטיבים, שזה פחות או יותר קונסיסטנטי עם מה שהיה בסקר הקודם מ-2013. ועם זאת, אנחנו רואים שהגיל החציוני, median age, של יהודים קונסרבטיביים הוא 62, שזה המבוגר ביותר מבין כל התנועות, ואנחנו גם רואים שבקרב יהודים צעירים בגילאי 18 עד 29, רק 8% מזדהים כקונסרבטיביים. ואני רוצה, זה נתון לא פשוט להקל, אני חושב. אני רוצה לשאול אתכם, איך הגענו למציאות הזו? איך אתם מסבירים את העובדה, את הנתונים עליו שהרגע ציינתי? אתה רוצה להתחיל?
Yes.
Sure, I'm happy to. First of all, here, I'll tell you that. Yeah, maybe that's a good idea.
Jacob, here's one there.
No, let's do that? Yeah. Okay, that way you can own this microphone.
Exactly.
Okay, so Devon Rishon, first of all, it's wonderful to be here. I was here exactly 2 years ago in this room. I remember many faces from being here. It was 2 days after I took on my first job being the Mankal of the RA. And now to be back 2 years later feels wonderful. And it's also, I think, the first time I'm really speaking before a large group of people. So it's wonderful to be here along with my wonderful colleagues. And actually, I would say, Moshe, one of the interesting things actually is exactly from, I've only been able to watch 2 episodes so far of this amazing program. It's not big news for us, but to think about it in terms of how what you're presenting in that program is reflected for Israelis who really would not know what American Judaism and American Jewish life look like. It's been eye-opening and fascinating. It's also very entertaining. I have to say, both Moshe and Guri are super entertaining, so it's worth it. But one of the interesting things that I've noticed, at least in the first 2 episodes, is that some of the people that you're interviewed are like a Reform rabbi, right, or an Orthodox or Haredi rabbi. The conservative Jews are usually not labeled. Right? A great example is the person from Colorado. Right? He's running the backcountry bite. So he says, oh, I grew up as a conservative Jew. He speaks Hebrew. He's very identified with the state of Israel. He is out in the woods of Colorado, meeting Jews, bringing them home for Shabbat, baking challah with them, having a l'chaim, teaching Torah. He would not label himself a conservative Jew, right? So even though he is living our Judaism, our Masorti conservative Judaism, he would not, in the Pew survey, be part of that market data of 8%. But the Judaism that he's celebrating and that he is bringing out into the world is very much our Judaism. And this is the blessing and the curse of being a centrist movement, is that we rarely talk about ourselves as Masorti or conservative. We rarely use that label. And all the more so, younger Jews never use the label, right? Because the minute they would label themselves, they're limiting themselves. But we know that our Yahudut is exactly that kind of Judaism. And we have to figure out what to do with that, right? There's what we call in English market share, which is what the Pew Report sort of measures, and mind share, what people think and do, which is obviously much more important. So just that differentiation alone makes me suspect the 8% figure. I'm still worrisome because we have to figure out what does it mean? To what extent do we care that people actually identify themselves as part of our movement? Or to what extent do we just say, being a centrist Jew who works in all those tensions of tradition and change and halacha and free choice and all of those things, all the things we wrestle with, how important is it simply that people are doing that wrestling and living that life?
Great response. And my pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Nגיד and here, and wonderful to greet all of you. I'm just going to add briefly to what Jaicob said, add 2 points. One is that just to kind of emphasize the fact that young American Jews, like young Americans, don't want to label themselves and understand themselves as having multiple identities, and to say that they are conservative Jews or that they are any label feels limiting to them, and so they just are allergic to labels. The second point that I would make is that if you look historically at the evolution of conservative Judaism, what conservative Judaism understood itself as doing is promoting American Judaism at the time, a centrist vision of tradition and change, and they were not, and it is the stream of Judaism that is most self-identified and sees itself as being concerned with Klal Yisrael in the broadest sense of the term. And so you spent many years at Ramah. Ramah understood itself as really modeling a living Judaism for American Jews that was meaningful and flourishing and involved education and tefillah and living as a Jew, playing baseball as a Jew. But Ramah did not say, rah, rah, conservative Jews, just remember you're a conservative Jew. It's like, remember you're a Jew. And so our blessing is also our liability.
Do you mind if I stand? I think there are people in the back, and I haven't been a congregational rabbi for a long time. So I thought I would deliver a Nidre sermon in 20 minutes. It is lovely to be back. I miss Israel and wasn't able to come this year. One of the perks of my job running the rabbinical school in Los Angeles and in Berlin is that I get to make Aliyah for 10 days a year. And I'm now off by a year. But I'll be back in February for a longer time. And it's nice to see so many familiar faces. I want to say something more gloomy than my optimistic friends here. I think that as a denomination, we're facing a very difficult time. We grew in an age in which American culture embraced ethnicity. and ethnic differences were your way in. So there was an Irish neighborhood, an Italian neighborhood, and whatever, and this was before we were white. So you knew when you were in the Jewish neighborhood or the German neighborhood or the Italian neighborhood because you got beat up in 2 of them, but not in the 3rd. Right? And that's changed. America isn't seeing itself as a collection of different ethnicities, and that's a shift, that's a growth. Good or bad, that's for you to decide, but it's not what Americans think of themselves anymore. And so the kind of Jewish message that we packaged, in part, is simply out of step with where the culture is at the moment. And then the second challenge I think we face as a movement that I know we're all wrestling with coming up with a better job is we created a somewhat dispassionate way of being Jewish. We gave academic interpretations of text, and we gave very thoughtful, very somewhat heady sermons, and we left people often hungry. And that hunger has now come back to us. So I shouldn't be telling you anything new, and I'm certainly not saying anything that my colleagues haven't been at the forefront of trying to adjust and change. But I think the challenge and opportunity for our time is how do we create a way of being Jewish that is inspiring and courageous and bold and authentic in terms of knowing something about the sources and the history of the Jews. And part of what now links us in that struggle is that we are the 2 of us, 2 communities that make up now 80% of the Jewish people. And that 80% is located in 5 cities. The 5th is Haifa, just in case everyone gets the other 4. But that means the Jews have shrunk. We've coagulated into certain big metropolis areas, and we're not scattered the way we were. So how do we create really dynamic, meaningful communities that are not driven by fundamentalism? Because fundamentalism is a big advantage if you fit in it. It's crushing if you don't. But if you fit, it's awesome. You have a full social life. Right? So how do we meet the loneliness of your average Israeli or American Jew? How do we create a Judaism that doesn't dodge the big questions? You know, we're in a time of atrocious climate change. We're in the process of destroying our planet. I don't need to go on with the other challenges facing us. You can come up with that list. But does Judaism have something to say about that? And does it have something to say that's not just my opinion, but that's rooted in look at the Masorah and look at the wisdom that we can bring to bear to elevate that question? And then the last thing I'll just say on the subject at the moment is there are a lot of technical and real things that divide us, our 2 communities. And having a grounded love for each other that enables us to survive those differences and maybe occasionally learn from each other. Why would you make that choice? Why is this such a problem for you? Instead of just blowing each other off. Oh, well, you guys are Israelis, you're too right-wing, oh, you tippy-flippy American Californians, right? If we can actually start to listen to each other as we talk about these things, I think we're going to find under the surface shared challenges that we can actually help each other do better with.
אתה, בתשובה שלך עכשיו, בראד, מתחיל בעצם לדבר על מה אנחנו כתנועה צריכים לעשות על מנת, המילה להציל זה המילה הנכונה, אבל לשמור על דינמיות, על חיוניות, על רלוונטיות עבור אותם יהודים צעירים. אתה מציף פה את השאלות, אני סקרן לשמוע האם אתם כאנשים שאחראים על הכשרת המנהיגות של התנועה, על המוסדות של התנועה, איך זה נראה? איך זה נראה עכשיו? איך אתם מתרגמים את העשייה הזאת אולי לתפסים יותר מעשיים, כן? לאיזושהי פרוגרמה שתשמור על החיוניות והרלוונטיות של התנועה גם בעתיד. מה מתחולל כרגע? מה הדיונים שמתחוללים? אם אתם מוכנים לחלוק איתנו את המחשבות שלכם על איך התנועה יכולה להמשיך לשמור על החיוניות שלה. זה היה מובן? So, look, that is the big question. The fact that I'm not sure I have a full answer, but I think we are beginning to understand that our movement faces a real dilemma, which is we are perfectly, in the United States, we are perfectly programmed for folks over the age of 50, mostly partnered, and mostly either with 1.5 children or an empty nester. Our synagogues are programmed for that space. Many of our programs are meant for that space. And all of our resources, through synagogue dues, through our organizations, are all geared towards that space. We barely, quite frankly, invest enough in our teens, not nearly enough. Ramah camps should be bigger. They all have waiting lists. We should have more of them. And our US-wide programs are struggling, partly because it's a competitive market, and partly because it's underfunded. And then we look at the next set of spaces, college campuses, which we have disinvested from, and young adults, and today young adulthood usually stretches from around 18, 19, and college age in North America through sometimes mid-30s, late 30s. So there's now this 15, 20-year gap where we're not having the influence on people, and as Brad so beautifully said, and those folks are seeking meaning, and they are lonely. They're having trouble connecting with each other and with their Judaism and their Jewish roots, and with something that gives meaning to their purpose in their life. We have begun interesting projects to begin to understand what we could be doing. I'll give just one example, which is in the Washington area. We have a project, it's now called The Den. It was originally a collaboration of the local congregations. We sat down together as rabbis and realized that the folks in their 20s and 30s were not coming into our doors. So we decided maybe we need to actually go to them. So we hired a very talented young colleague, Rabbi Schwartz. He helped found both a local day camp, a Ramah day camp, and also in his spare time, in other words, in his second full-time job, created an engagement project to learn more about this group of 20 and 30-year-olds. And what we found is there are certain rules and needs when we're working with that population. Number one, it has to be on their terms. It can't be what we want. It's totally based on what they want. That's number one. Number two, we have to be where they are, both physically and spiritually. We cannot expect them to come to us in either sense. What Rami and now Rabbi Derek Drucker, and we have a wonderful newer colleague, happened to grow up in my congregation as well. They spend most of their time having coffee with young Jews and Jewish, what I call Jewish adjacent folks, one at a time, learning about their life, learning about their needs. Our Jenna Turow is our other colleague, just took me a second to process, I'm jet lag. They spend time having coffee together, learning about who they are, what are they looking for, what's missing in their life, socially, in terms of ideas, in terms of connection, and then figuring out how to connect them with each other through particular activities or programs. No program at the Den has more than 10 or 15 people in it. We're not interested in the singles dance or the big Christmas ball or whatever it is, giving an alternative. Like, we're interested in is thinking about who's interested in very specific things. Baking challah together and then having a conversation. It's very much like the backcountry bike model. And they are reaching hundreds of young Jews every year. And doing it in really deep ways, with Torah, with connection, with thoughtfulness and care. It's fascinating to see. It's the kind of project that we now need to find the funding for and replicate across the country, and across North America. So those are the kinds of things that we need to start to do. It's very individual, one-on-one, learning and talking and doing. It's also, quite frankly, very intensive, expensive to do. It's not, our Judaism in North America was based on a mass production model in the 1950s and 60s. Of how many families could we bring into one organization and use as few rabbis as possible and use as few clergy as possible to meet their spiritual needs. And that now has to be that model has to be completely overturned to a sense of how many
rabbis, cantors, educators, and we bring in to work as individually and carefully as possible with specific people to meet their specific needs and help empower them to ask and answer their own questions and create their own experiences. It's a very different model. Actually, quite frankly, we learn a lot from folks here in Israel and in other parts of the world who have been doing this work for a long time. Many of our colleagues here in Israel, for example, are entrepreneurial. They are creating their own communities and then seeing how they fit together. That's the work that we're going to have to start doing in North America, and it's very inspiring actually to see the kinds of efforts that my colleagues here in Israel are doing.
So what we do at JTS is train those leaders to do that kind of work. And we don't only train for the conservative movement, which is why I didn't initially respond, but given your first question about the ways in which Jews understand themselves, not necessarily denominationally, we are concerned with what does it take when we invest in a Jewish leader? What does one need to know, to be, to feel, to think, to believe, if one is to be an effective Jewish leader, not now, but in the future? What is the foundation for learning that is going to nourish a professional for the challenges that we don't know about yet? And that's what we do at JTS, right? We believe that it is that deep, intensive knowledge of owning our traditional Jewish texts, our language, the languages of our texts, the ideas, the history, the literature, the art, the ethics, all that we can take from our tradition, giving our students not only the learning that they get, but the skills to become lifelong learners, because we have to continually nourish ourselves. We need to give them the experience, the spiritual, personal sense of their own religious identity, and give them the experiences out in the community so that they have the skills to lead in different kinds of settings. And that is why so many of the individuals out there that have founded so many of these startups are, some of them are our own alums, not only our alums, but they have this kind of education that prepares them to lead in the future. Never has this been more obvious than during COVID, when every leader had to fly by the seat of their pants, is the English expression, right? And figure out over a weekend how to lead in a different way. And the unbelievable success that they experienced is a kind of testament to that kind of deep learning and commitment that we can offer.
My teacher, Jacob Pressman, Rabbi Jacob Pressman, used to say, well, everything has been said, but not by everyone.
I should use that. That's a great idea.
So I'll be brief, but I have three thoughts to add to what my colleagues have said. We run a program called BCI, Brandeis Collegiate Institute. It was started by Shlomo Bardin about 80 years ago. It's out in Simi Valley, in what we like to call the largest piece of Jewish-owned real estate outside the state of Israel. Use that one too. And every summer we bring in about 100 to 150 collegians from all across North America, Latin America, Europe, Africa, and Israel. And we teach a Judaism of the body. We teach, it's going to sound very chalutznicky, we have them farming in the fields and dancing the hora at lunch, and, you know, typical Israeli day. Doing art, having Jewish arguments. I was just there on Friday before I came here talking to them about what would it be like to believe in a God who loves you and doesn't have coercive power, right? And what's amazing is, you know, even the Israelis wind up after 4 weeks, 6 weeks of this, saying, I never knew there was this kind of way to be Jewish. And we don't label what kind it is. It just happens that the rabbis who they learn with are all Ziglar graduates, and me, and Rabbi Elliot Dorff, and some of the greatest minds out there who are willing to give them a full-bodied Jewish experience. 2, we run the country's largest Introduction to Judaism program. So our Miller Introduction Judaism program has converted thousands of people in Los Angeles every year, but we now have 70 satellite programs that are operating all around North America. It was endorsed by the Rabbinical Assembly. We have groups in Europe. We have a class in Mambale, Uganda, where a Ziglar graduate is being a rabbi. And through that, we have brought, and what's amazing, and this leads into what the Chancellor said as well, you know, what I did that was utterly brilliant in this was to hire someone young who didn't think like me, right? And Rabbi Adam Greenwald has been extraordinary. The minute he comes up with something, it looks totally obvious to me. It's just that in a million years, I would never have thought of it, right? And so part of it is training people to enter a land we're not going to follow, right? And empowering them to make decisions that make us really uncomfortable, right? And getting out of the way. Sometimes it means writing a check and then getting out of the way, but it does mean getting out of the way. The last thing I want to say that I know that Jaicob and I have talked about extensively before is part of bringing Judaism to them is going to involve not deep personal transformation, but regular electronic ways of connecting. So I have a public figure Facebook page that has 80,000 likes, in part because I'm so easy to like, but in part, every week I put out something from the Parsha that doesn't tell you how to be a better Jew, it tells you how to thrive as a human being. It gives you for that. So about half of the people who like my page don't seem to be Jewish to me by any stretch of the imagination, and a good quarter of them seem to have Arabic as their primary language. But I want you to think about what that means, that most weeks I get some letter from somebody in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or whatever saying, I've never met a Jew, I've never talked to a rabbi, I want to convert, will you help me? And I generally say, when you're writing to me from Montreal, give me a call. Right? But the fact is we do live in a world in which people are starving for wisdom. They're starving for something real, and if we can make that our focus in whatever means possible. So for some people, that is going to mean those old brick and mortar synagogues with a more dynamic service, or even not, those old services. I like responsive readings. But some people are never going to be shul goers. Some people are going to find other ways to connect. And if we can give them authentic ways in, it seems to me that in some ways that's the fulfillment of the Zionist dream, right? That when we had our own country in this land, Judaism wasn't a religion. It wasn't a religio. It was the life of the Jewish people. And now that we once again have our own land and our own self-determination, I think in some ways it's time to bring back that vision that Judaism isn't a collection of creeds and obligations. It's a way of being alive, of being more alive because of what Judaism brings to us, and that's really the agenda.
Fascinating. You mentioned before, Brad, that there are two epicenters, אני לא יודע עברית בעצם, סליחה. הצעת מקודם ששני מרכזים גדולים של העם היהודי, ושיש שתי נושאים גדולים שמפרידים בין שתי המרכזים הללו. אני רוצה שנצלול בנושא אחד שעלה לכותרות בצורה מאוד ברורה בשבועות האחרונים, אולי בעיקר בעקבות המבצע האחרון בעזה. כן, וזה הסכסוך הישראלי-פלסטיני. על פי אותו סקר פיו שציינתי מקודם, 70% מהיהודים הקונסרבטיבים בארצות הברית מזדהים עם המפלגה הדמוקרטית ומזדהים כשמאל ליברלי בארצות הברית, וגם תומכים בפתרון שתי המדינות בצורה מאוד מאוד ברורה ומובהקת על פי אותו סקר. כאן בישראל התנועה המסורתית נמנעת מלהביע עמדה סביב הסוגיות הללו כמדיניות. ובעבר לזה, החברה הישראלית באופן כללי נראה שדי מתרחקת מהשיח על פתרון שתי המדינות. רק השבוע שר החוץ שלנו אמר שהודיע לשרי החוץ של האיחוד האירופי שזה לא הולך לקרות בזמן הקרוב. אני סקרן לשמוע איך חוסר העמדה או ההימנעות של התנועה המסורתית כאן בישראל להביע עמדה פוליטית של שמאל ליברלי משפיעה על היחסים בין יהודים קונסרבטיבים בארצות הברית לבין התנועה המסורתית כאן בישראל, וגם אני סקרן לשמוע אולי מה אתם מצפים מיהודים מסורתיים כאן סביב, להביע עמדה סביב הסוגיה המאוד מאוד טעונה הזאת. שאלה מורכבת. To ask the question again? I'll ask it very briefly. According to Pew, 70% of conservative Jews are Democrats and support the two-state solution. Here in Israel, it seems like the movement refrains from taking any stance on this question. I'm curious how this impacts the relationship between the two movements, between conservative Jews and Israelis, that are kind of saying two-state solution is not viable.
Great. So I did actually understand most of that. Okay. I don't know how to answer that question without getting into trouble.
Has that ever stopped you, Brad?
No. You only caught the stuff I couldn't filter. So here's the challenge. If Judaism is not just the rituals inside the Knesset, then it has implications that are political. Political is the term for communities making substantive decisions about what's okay and what's not okay. So deciding, for example, to have a mechitza or not is a political decision. It's not just spiritual. So part of the challenge is we raised our kids with the idea that Judaism changes the world. It makes the world better. And that's going to get sticky when you look at choices the Jewish community has made that don't always seem motivated by the best of our Jewish values. Right? Now I want to be clear because I just snuck in something subjective there. Right? You can find plenty of Jewish texts that can support swindling people to the extent that they can bear it. I'll find you those sources if you want. So if you're a Jewish landlord in a minority neighborhood and you want to be a slumlord, you'll find a rabbi who will say that's fine. And you can find a shul where they just don't talk politics. But your kids don't want to spend time in that place. I don't want to spend time in that place. You can find texts that talk about the ways you should treat an Eved Knani and how you should handle people who are occupying our land. Find those texts, they're horrific. And the problem is American Jews, young ones, have read those texts and look at current policies and they say, I don't want to be implicated in that. Now, I want to be clear here because I know I'm talking about very edgy things. I do not think that Israel is to blame for the occupation alone. I think there are many, many, many Hamas and Hezbollah and the Saudis and there's a whole lot of people who have, but the way we have occupied has not been the best way to occupy. And every time we try to have that conversation, we're either told, well, you're from LA, you live a fat and lazy life, so butt out. Or not now, how can you raise that now? But if that's all you say in response to people who love you and feel like your family and have a concern, then eventually you can't be surprised when they walk away. And they say, well, fine, there's nothing we can talk about then. We're going to talk shatnez all the time. We're going to talk second day yantif. Like, I'm out of here. So part of the challenge for both of us is can we have those really hard conversations? Do you understand my kids in the IDF risking their life every day? Do you know what it's like to be in a bomb shelter and have those bombs going over my head? Let me talk to you about what I'm experiencing. And American Jews need to listen. But then, when they say, well, what are you doing long term so that you're not in the mikvah a year from now? Right? What are we doing so that maybe we're occupying smarter and better so that we can start to incentivize someone who someday will talk to us about this in a real way? That's the biggest divide I can think of. And the Israeli community has shifted right on a whole lot of issues. Do you see what I'm wearing? Right? David Ben-Gurion dies another death every time someone puts this on, but I was told I had to wear a tie to meet people in the Knesset. Israel's changed. Right? Israel's moved. So has American Jews. And if we can't find ways to talk about what's driving us, if all we do is we brush each other off, well, you guys can't see it because you're in it all the time. Well, you guys can't see it because you're living a fat, comfortable life. Then it breaks apart. And so I think what I try to push in America, some of you may have seen there was a letter that some rabbinical students wrote.
We'll talk about it.
Then I'll save the good part for later. I will just close by saying my love for Israel is deeper than any political policy or government. And I say that about the United States too. God knows America has done and does many horrific things, and I am a patriotic American who loves his country, often despite what the government is doing or has done. And I teach my students that their love of Israel has to be deeper than politics. Because in some ways you can't be a full Jew today, I don't think, without having a profound connection to the state, the land, and the people of Israel. But we have to do that then by being open to many, many ways to being a Zionist, and we haven't been good at that.
Great, so actually let's talk about that letter. נדבר על המכתב המפורסם, שאני מקווה שאתם יודעים על מה מדובר, אבל אני אתן קצת הקדמה. אז באמת במהלך המבצע האחרון שהתרחש כאן, מבצע שומרי החומות, נשמעה ביקורת אולי חריפה יותר מן הרגיל מצד יהודים פרוגרסיביים בארצות הברית, כלפי המדיניות של מדינת ישראל והמבצע עצמו. ואחד מהביטויים הכי בולטים של הביקורת הזאת הייתה באמת אותו מכתב רבנים, או תלמידי רבנות. כ100 תלמידי רבנות של מוסדות של יהדות פלורליסטית בארצות הברית חתמו על המכתב הזה, שגינה את ישראל בצורה מאוד מאוד ברורה, וכמעט, לא כמעט, ולא הזכיר את החמאס ואת מידת האחריות שלו, של הארגון הזה, לסבב האחרון של האלימות. ובין החותמים על המכתב הזה, יש גם, תקנו אותי אם אני טועה, 13 תלמידים של המוסדות של התנועה. אוקיי, 12, בסדר, אז 12 סך הכל מהתנועה הקונסרבטיבית. אני סקרן לשמוע מכם, אולי במיוחד משניכם, איך אתם מסבירים את זה שהמנהיגות העתידית של יהדות צפון אמריקה מרגישה לא רק בנוח, מרגישה מחויבת להעביר ביקורת כזאת כלפי ישראל ולגנות את ישראל בפומבי. זה משהו שבאמת מציב בסימן שאלה מאוד מאוד קשה את עתיד היחסים בינינו. אנשים פה באמת הזדעזעו מהמכתב הזה בצורה מאוד עמוקה. אז איך אתם מסבירים את התופעה הזאת? כן.
I can only imagine how you reacted to that letter. It was heartbreaking for us to see that so many students signed that letter. The ignorance in the letter was painful. It was painful. You asked there are so many things that were raised by your question, so I'll just start a little bit in a segue to what Brad spoke about before. You know, love of Israel comes from many different places, and part of it is knowledge. Right? What is it that young people know about Israel? What is it that American Jews know they don't have in their hearts? What those of us who were educated in a different era have, who lived through different wars and conflicts than the wars that students in their 20s have experienced. Yes, our country is moving to the left as Israel is moving to the right. And that also means that students, and these rabbinical students who come out of colleges and universities in the United States, have been hearing for 4 years, Israel is a colonialist state, it is an apartheid state. You, Jew who cares about liberal causes, you can't join our organization if you support the Zionist in a pejorative sense, if you support the Zionist state. This is indicative of a rise of anti-Semitism in the United States, and as we know, all over the world. And for students, these were young students, our students, who had not yet had their year in Israel, who come out of that milieu and who have a lot to learn. And, you know, in part, that comes from there has to be a curiosity, a desire to learn, an interest in knowing more. And that's, again, a two-way street, right? And the work that you're doing is exactly trying to bridge those gaps of helping make the new Jews in America more understandable to Israeli Jews. So, you know, I guess the other thing I would say, I can't really speak to young people in Israel, but certainly in the United States, there's a sense of entitlement and empowerment that comes to young people already in their 20s. So my late husband was a rabbi. When he was in his first year of rabbinical school, he did not think he had a rabbinic voice that the world wanted to hear from him. He was there to learn, and it took him many years to feel comfortable using that voice and that platform. As you saw from the 100 students who signed, they thought the world needed to hear from them. And that's something else they need to learn, a little humility, in addition to a lot more knowledge. On the other hand, you know, we're educators. So our job is to find the teachable moment in everything. And so these students needed tochecha. And, you know, Brad and I chose different ways to deliver that. I chose to do that privately with our students in small groups to help them understand the pain that they had caused, the errors, the omission, that you can be painful as much in what you don't say as what you do say. When is the moment to speak? The unintended consequences of one's speech. All of this are lessons that these students are learning and will never forget and will shape their rabbinates. I feel fortunate that these individuals who want to be religious leaders are studying under our care, because we have the opportunity to help them grow and learn. And they will be better rabbis for it, and they will be much more capable of then working with those young Jews who are now still on the college campuses and still trying to navigate what does it mean to be a proud Jew in an American university in this decade.
Brad, כשאתה מתייחס, and your answer could also relate to your specific response, because it was public, it was on the pages of the forward, I read it, I think an hour after it came out or something like that. I'm curious, also what led into that, and it was a very Khalif response also. So
there were 100 rabbinical students self-identified from various different rabbinical schools. They wrote a very strong condemnation of the occupation. It was entirely about this strong condemnation of the occupation and how their hearts were breaking, which they then published in the foreword, which is kind of the American Jewish publication of record, like that has the biggest hit, I think. When I talked to one of the students who signed it, she said it was on purpose. Like, they could have just said 100 Jews, and it probably wouldn't have gotten published at all. They could have just written the letter as 100 rabbinical students, sent it to the deans of their rabbinical schools, and that would have been a series of conversations. So you have to, I think, understand this not as a personal expression, but as an act of social activism. And what I said to my students is that a public act of social activism demands a public response. So I'm not in any way questioning how Shuly handled it at JTS. I'm speaking purely about why I did what I did. I have a very close relationship with my students. It's very important to me that we be candid with each other. So I wrote them before I published the letter and said, this is coming out as a response. You guys tied my hands, right? You didn't come to me with the letter and say, what do you think? We could have had a very interesting conversation. You published this in the middle of the missiles coming down, and it demands a response. It demands a response from the other students who chose not to sign. It demands a response from my faculty, from the donors who are part of our community, and frankly, our friends out in the world who expect a certain content of teaching and support. I wrote the letter, published the letter. It had a life of its own. So the letter, in addition to generating conversations with each of the students and then getting flooded by emails from all the other students who felt that their reputation was on the line. That if people thought that's what graduates of the Ziegler School thought, then everyone would assume they thought that too. And after all, the rest of the school had chosen not to sign the letter. But I also got called by AP, and they did an interview with me that became an article that was published in 300 newspapers around North America and around the world, and was read by over 1 million people. I got emails from most of the Israeli members of the Rabbinical Assembly saying thank you. I got a lot of American rabbis saying thank you, of all denominations. I heard from a fair number of Orthodox Israeli rabbis saying thank you. I became, which is unusual for me, a darling of the right. Not yet sure whether I'm going to sell out to that or not, but I'm trying it on.
You have to wear a top, keep wearing a top.
Well, there you go. So I give it up. I also received 2 colleagues who called me in private to criticize my decision, which I totally respect. One member of our faculty who also called me up and had an appointment to tell me why I was wrong to go public the way I did, and 3 colleagues who excoriated me on Twitter and on Facebook for having gone public criticizing the students, which I thought was a little complicated. But here's what I want to say. The letter was strong in its criticism, but loving of the students. And so I want to say what that means here, because there are 2 things I think could be misheard from what the chancellor said, and I want to phrase them a different way to make sure you hear it. I love my students. I love the students who signed that letter. The students who signed that letter love Israel. The letter was an expression of pain because they love Israel, and nobody listens to them. I actually am proud of my students for speaking out about contentious moral issues of our time. I don't think that's chutzpah. I think that's exactly the right job of young people. Young people are supposed to say things that old people are too scared to say out loud. And a lot of times that means they say things that are wrong and stupid, but history is made by the young people who said, you know what, maybe we should give women the vote, right? Or maybe this prohibition is a bad idea, or hey, let's start a Zionist entity in the Middle East. Right? A lot of young people say a lot of stupid things that wind up being great. So I don't criticize them for that, but what I criticized them for was I said, how could you put out that letter and not also want to express your love for the people of Israel? How could you not want to say something about our relatives who are terrified in bomb shelters? How can you not want to say something about 4,000 missiles that fell on? You don't have to not talk about Palestinian suffering. I salute and support you in raising that to our attention as a moral issue. We do need to pay attention to that, but not if you're going to fall silent about Jewish suffering or, frankly, about the right of Jewish self-determination in our own land. If you want to say all those things and then say what that letter said, I would shut up. But you cannot put out that letter in a way that implicates us without saying that first. Now, for many of the students, I think what it was not so much arrogance as they are politically untrained. I worked for the Speaker of the California State Assembly for 2 years before I went to rabbinical school. He was, no offense, the most important teacher I had for the rabbinate, right? And I had great teachers at JTS. But what I learned from Willie Brown was, how do you decide when to take on an issue? How do you decide what language will allow someone who doesn't agree with you to hear it and not go crazy? How do you decide when it's not the right time to raise a question, right? How do you do it in a way that builds community and leads to a successful outcome? Our students have never had that, and they live in the age of Twitter. So you think about something for the 20 seconds it takes you to type it out, and then you push send, and then you think about it, right? So one of the things we're going to be doing is having a course next year in the politics of communication, right? To make those choices. I had one of those signers of the letter say she was shocked by how vehement a response it got. Don't tell me that. Tell me you thought it was important enough to generate. Don't tell me you're surprised that everyone got upset with you. So I think it was a deeply transformative and educational moment. I want to assure you that I do not yet believe that American Jews are backing away for their love of Israel. Every single poll that has been taken shows, even among the young, that their commitment to the state of Israel and to the Jewish people here is very, very off the charts strong, more than they agree on pretty much anything. But here's what has shifted. They are no longer willing to ignore the suffering of the Palestinians. That has become part of a Jewish agenda that can't be swept away and isn't about Hasbara, and it's not about how comfortable we are. It's just, it's no longer tolerable for them. So if we don't want to see more of those letters, and I really don't want to see more of those letters, not just because I'm a fine and noble moral person, but because it made my fundraising much more difficult this year, then we have to also look at what are the things that Israel is doing that makes the occupation worse than it has to be. I don't think there's any way to unoccupy at the moment. I think that's unrealistic. But there are a whole lot of things that Israel could be doing right now within its own legal framework that could alleviate an enormous amount of the anguish of the Palestinians and of the American Jews whose hearts are being torn.
תודה. אני סקרן, הייתה אכזבה מאוד גדולה פה בישראל מהתגובה של החלק הארי, המרכזי של בצפון אמריקה, השמאל הליברלי, התגובה של אותה אוכלוסייה כלפי המבצע, כלפי מה שקורה כאן, הייתה תגובה מאוד חלשה, מאוד רפה, מאוד מינורית. וזה הוביל לאכזבה שגדולה בקרב המון ישראלים שראו מה מתחולל ברשתות החברתיות, מה מתחולל במדיה, וציפו שיהודים אמריקאים יעמדו לצידם, וזה לא בהכרח קרה בקולות מספיק ברורים. ואני סקרן, השאלה שלי לא על זה, השאלה שלי דווקא לכיוון ההפוך. איפה אנחנו מאכזבים אתכם? מתי אתם הייתם רוצים לשמוע את הקול שלנו, והקול שלנו לא נשמע מספיק חזק או מספיק ברור? איזה מדיניות יש לנו? אתה ציינת עכשיו את הסיפור של איך אפשר לנהל את הסכסוך בצורה יותר טובה ממה שמנהל היום. מעבר לסוגיה הזאת, או רוצה להרחיב על הסוגיה הזאת, איפה האכזבה שלכם מאיתנו, ומה אנחנו צריכים לדעת שכואב לכם כשמסתכלים עלינו?
I'm not sure I'll answer that question exactly, but I will say that I think that, and we've talked about this together a lot actually today, the biggest crisis of our time is that we are in a time where we live in the black and white instead of in the gray. And that leads to disappointment, because when we lose our ability to understand complexity and nuance, that was an issue with the letter, is that it was in black and white terms. Israel must be wrong. It can't be complicated. The circumstances around the recent issues in Gaza, in my opinion, were complicated. The way that the conflict started was complicated. I'm not taking sides. I'm just saying that I think it's complicated. What's happening in Yerushalayim is complicated. There are different ways of looking at it. And we disappoint each other when we can't have that conversation. Now, in the middle of bombs being dropped on Israel, that's not the time to have the conversation. That's a time to say, I love you, I care about you, how can I support you, how can I be with you, we're in solidarity with you, there are reasons for the decisions that the government is taking, we'll sort them out later. Right now, we just love and care about you, and that, as Brad and Shuly have pointed out, was missing from that letter, and I think our students understand that now. The ones that I've spoken with seem to understand it, and understand the need for nuance. The question is, can we learn to have, and can we make space for those conversations? The other thing I've learned actually a lot from the Hartman Institute here is that we hold the same values. We just sometimes put them in different priority order. My reflection on that letter is that there is a great tension in Judaism between the particular and the universal. How much do we care about ourselves and our own people, especially given our history, our need to defend ourselves and to see that we are threatened? And now I think we have learned, unfortunately, not just in Israel, but in other parts of the world, including America and North America, there is anti-Semitism, it's real. And no matter what we do, it is there. And actually one of the great disappointments of Zionism is that it has not disappeared with a strong Israel. And in fact, Israel is now the Jew of the nations, and we, in our support for Israel, have only invited additional anti-Semitism. And we have to figure out a different way of dealing with it, because Zionism has not realized that truth. That was the plan. Turned out it didn't work. So what do we do with the fact that we have a need to be particulars, to care about our people here in Israel and all over the world? And at the same time, we have Isaiah telling us this week, for Shabbat Chazon, giving us a deep sense that our moral character is more important than our ritual character, and that a politics that is divorced from ethics, universal ethics, is worthless. It's a worthless Judaism, and it's a worthless Zionism. So what do we do with those two truths? We have to hold them in tension. And different people, both here in Israel and in Chutz La'aretz, are going to hold that tension in different places. And we disappoint each other when we come at it from a black and white absolute position instead of from a space of real dialogue, real understanding, and real wrestling with how we're going to handle that, and being able to hear each other.
So I actually have one last question, and then, and this question is specifically for you, Shuly, if that's okay with you. אני אעשה את זה בעברית, אם זה בסדר שוב. התנועה הקונסרבטיבית מתגאה בזה שהיא תנועה שוויונית, במשך עשרות שנים, זה חלק מה-DNA של התנועה, ועם זאת, את האישה הראשונה שעומדת בראש מוסד מכובד כמו ה-JTS, בשנת 20, נכנס לתפקיד ממש לא מזמן, נכון? לפני שנה? כן? זה כך עד שנת 2020 כדי שהדבר הזה יקרה. איך את מסבירה את זה? איפה אנחנו נמצאים בתנועה? שאלה מעניינת.
אוקיי.
ואני אוסיף עוד שאלה, אולי פאנל לדבר הזה. מה ההשלכות, מה ההשפעה של העובדה שאת עומדת בראש JTS? What's the impact of that?
So first, I'll just say that it's a huge honor to have this role. I didn't seek it, I didn't expect it. Some of you might know I was on the search committee to find the new chancellor, and I worked really hard to do that. No, but I took it with great joy when I was approached. Just as we were going into lockdown, actually, and I said, well, I think I need a little time. I was the provost, so the chief academic officer at the time, and I said, well, we have to move everything to online learning. I can't think about it now. And then over Pesach, when nobody could go anywhere, it gave me plenty of time to think. So, you know, I think about this from two different perspectives because I'm also a historian of gender. And I've spent decades really trying to recover the remarkable women that have had an impact on our history as a Jewish people. Women who often went unnamed and were often, very often, if they were named, unappreciated, their achievements under-acknowledged, and that is something that became very obvious to me. I was a student at JTS in the 70s, getting my doctorate in American Jewish history, and there were a lot of women at JTS in the graduate school with me hoping to become rabbis. JTS did not admit women to rabbinical school for another decade, and so those women are now Reform rabbis and Reconstructionist rabbis, except for one or two who actually had the patience to come back a decade later. So really, my whole career, I've been thinking a lot, not only professionally about the leaders that we train at JTS, but about women leaders and what it means to lead in a professional role, then as a dean, then as the provost. So I am well aware of the tremendous symbolic significance of my being the first woman in this role. The first female student at JTS was Henrietta Zold. As we know, her main impact, not beyond her years as a scholar, and she was indeed a prodigious scholar, not in a conventional sense, was her love of Eretz Israel, her founding of Hadassah, the life that she lived here, and of course the movement that she spawned, which not only played such a pivotal role in the creation of the state of Israel, but also empowered women in the United States by educating them about Eretz Israel. So I can just say, when my appointment was announced, I got many wonderful letters, but two kinds of notes were particularly meaningful to me. One was from a whole generation of young women leaders in their 20s and 30s who felt that my being appointed to this role would lift all boats. It would make it possible for them to reach whatever heights in their career that they aspired to. And it was extremely meaningful for them. The other was from parents, fathers, mothers, of daughters who felt the same way. That fathers of young children, young daughters, who really felt that, you know, the feminist phrase of you can't be it if you can't see it. Right? So to be able to see a woman in this role really, really would open their eyes to a different kind of future. And if I can have that kind of impact, how lovely, while I'm also trying to do my job. So.
תודה רבה, it's very inspiring. יושב ראש התנועה, לתת איזושהי תגובה לדברים ששמענו כאן, להגיב בשם כל הישראלי.
אנשים שמכירים אותי מנועם קוראים לי רק סופי פלמן ולא רפלוביץ'.
סליחה.
זה סיבך אותנו היום בכנסת, פלמן רפלוביץ'.
סליחה.
הכל בסדר. סתם, זה מעניין. תודה רבה לכם. היה ממש מעניין, עברתי לשם כי יכולתי להתרכז יותר טוב. היה מאוד מאוד מעניין, היה מאוד אמיץ. פתרתם דברים שקשה לפתוח אותם וקשה לומר אותם, ואני מעריכה אתכם מאוד על זה. אני רוצה לומר שאנחנו, בהרבה בחינות, אנחנו בעידן חדש, אנחנו בעידן באמת של הרבה מאוד שותפות ארגונית בין ישראל ובין צפון אמריקה, בכלל, גם בעולם. למשל, כשאתם ביקשתם מאיתנו להוציא תגובה על מה שקורה כאן, לקח לנו בערך 3-4 ימים לנסח תגובה שיכולה להישמע טוב לאוזניים האמריקאיות, וגם להביע את המקומות המסובכים שאנחנו נמצאים בהם. לקח לנו באמת הרבה ניסוחים ככה הלוך ושוב, וההחלטה שלנו בסופו של דבר הייתה בעיקר לספר מה עובר עלינו, ושיש כל מיני דעות לכאן ולכאן, ואני חושבת שזה עבר בסדר, אבל זה בזכות השותפות ובזכות הדיאלוג, ואני חושבת שזה המפתח. הרב ג'ייקוב דיבר על המתח, על המתחים שקיימים ועל הפערים, ולאלה מכם שהם חלק מהתהליך האסטרטגי שלנו, או השתתפו בקבוצות מיקוד, או רואיינו, יש פה הרבה מאוד אנשים, עלה מאוד הנושא הזה של הפערים והמתחים, ואיך אנחנו מגשרים עליהם. וכחלק מהתהליך התחלנו להגיע למסקנה שהמתחים והפערים הם לא הקושי, הם הסיפור. זה הסיפור, זה מי שאנחנו. ואם אנחנו יכולים להתבונן על המתחים ועל הפערים האלה בעיניים אחרות, ולהגיד שם, על המתח הזה, זאת הקרקע, ששם מתרחש הכסף. אז אנחנו באמת יכולים להתרומם ולעשות את הדבר שנועדנו לעשות. אז אני רוצה להודות לכם מאוד. אני רוצה להודות למרכז עולמי ולמשרד של זיגלר בארצן על ההפקה המאוד מהירה ומרשימה הזאת, ולכם שהתארגנתם מעכשיו לעכשיו להגיע, וגם שחלקתם איתנו את המחשבות שלכם ואת מה שיש לכם בתוך הלב, כי זו התחלה של השיח, זה התחלה של הקרקע ושל האדמה שאנחנו נשקה ונצמח ממנו. ותודה לך, משה.